Resourceful Designer, episode 242. A look back, a look ahead, 2020 edition.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, he's a pepper. I'm a pepper. Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? Just like your host, Mark DeCote?
Be a pepper, drink Dr. Oh, sorry. Podcast is going here. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is my, let's call it the year in review episode. I started this a couple of years ago and decided to make it an annual tradition that the last podcast of the year would be kind of a look back at the previous year that we just finished and a look ahead at what I'm thinking the next year will be like. And wow, what a doozy this year has been, hasn't it? Now, in case you're listening to this in the future, this is the end of 2020, and that's pretty much all I have to say, and you'll get the gist of what sort of year we just had. Now, unlike other episodes where I go in a little bit of what I've been up to, and then maybe a tip or a resource of the week and all that stuff, I usually skip that in this episode and get right into the meat of it. So if this is your first time listening to Resourceful Designer, first of all, thank you very much. I do appreciate you tuning in. But just be warned that this is not a typical episode, but that doesn't mean you're not going to get something from it. So in preparation for this episode, I actually went back and I listened to my 2018 and my 2019 edition of the Look Back, Look Ahead, just to see what I did and what sort of things I was talking about. And man, I'm going to go through the list of some of the goals I had for this year, but before I get to those, there's a few other things I want to share. So looking back at my numbers from 2020, let's start with the podcast itself. Resourceful Designer, I put out 47 podcast episodes, including this one here, which is down from the 50 I did in the previous year. I know there was a couple of weeks where I was on holiday and just didn't put out an episode, and there was just a couple of weeks that just work was so busy and so hectic that I just never got around to recording. So I put out 47 episodes, all-time downloads for the podcast. As of right today, I just checked my stats, over 500,000 downloads of the Resourceful Designer podcast, actually 558,000 and change. And about 150,000 of that was just in this past year. So that's all-time downloads I said earlier. 150,000 or just over 150,000 downloads in 2020 itself. Now, one of my goals for the year was to increase listenership for Resourceful Designer. And I can tell you that I failed, if you want to call it that, at that goal. But I don't think that was just me. With the whole pandemic, the whole COVID thing that happened this past year, I, along with most podcasters out there, saw a huge dip in their download numbers. And that just came about because a lot of people were at home with a lot of stuff to do. So the time they would normally spend listening to podcasts, they weren't. A lot of people listen to podcasts on their commute or when they're on their breaks from work or other things. And a lot of those people were just not consuming podcasts, or not as many as they were previously. So I saw my download numbers dip starting sometime in May, but June, July, August, and September were really low compared to previous years. But the numbers did start ticking up again in October. And looking back at the November numbers, they're almost around the same area or same ratio as they were from the previous year. So it looks like things are finally settling back to normal. But because of those dips, my overall podcast did not grow from last year. So even though that was a goal, that's not from lack of my part of doing anything. It's just the entire industry took a hit. Now, I am happy to say that I did launch Resourceful Designer on a couple of new platforms this year. Resourceful Designer is available on Ghana. So if you're listening from Ghana, which I guess is I've never actually heard of it until I was recommended that I launched a podcast on it. Ghana is a huge platform in India, I believe. And I'm getting quite a few downloads from there. So if you're listening on Ghana, welcome and thank you very much. as well as launching on Amazon Music. And that was not too long ago, actually. Amazon Music decided to include podcasts in their catalogs, and Resourceful Designer was one of the first podcasts submitted for inclusion. So if you listen to stuff via Amazon Music, you can access the podcast there as well. Now, looking through the stats for the podcast, two of the most popular episodes, or I shouldn't say two of the most popular episodes were my definitive guide to starting a home-based design business, which was actually a 3-part series. Well, if I look at my top 10, all 3 episodes in that series were within the top 5, but the first part of the series was the top downloaded podcast for the year, followed by number 2, which was SWOT analysis for designers. And that was episode 202, the definitive guide to starting a home-based design business series were episodes 204 to 206. So those were the most popular episodes of the year. So overall, I can't really complain about the podcasts. I'm reaching people in more countries than I ever thought possible. I'm reaching thousands of ears every week as people download the podcast to listen to it. And more people are still discovering and downloading. And I know this because I go back to episode 1, and episode 1 of the podcast is still getting a lot of downloads every month. So Resourceful Designer on a whole is growing. Now, some other things to do with the podcast, or at least to do with Resourceful Designer, the Facebook group has grown quite a bit this past year. We've surpassed 2,000 members in the Facebook group. And if you're not already a member, you can join by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/group. That will redirect you. And anybody who answers the 3 questions will be allowed in. Now, I still get a lot of people who don't answer the questions. Some of them are invited by people who are members and they have a friend that they think would be really good for the group. So they invite that person, but they fail to tell them to answer the questions. And if the questions are not answered, I decline their request to join. So if you do have a friend and you want them to join, make sure they know that they have to answer the questions or else I won't let them in. But we're now over 2,000 members in that group. And I have to say, what an amazing group of people that is. I don't have any moderators. I do it all myself, and I rarely ever have to moderate anything in the group. The people in it are just so great at helping, at discovering, at sharing, and what a wonderful group of people they are. Now, an even better group of people, at least as far as I think, is the Resourceful Designer community. Now, that is my paid community for designers, and we have an amazing group of people in there that, when I say sharing and helping, man, some of them go above and beyond. And it has become a real tight-knit community. People are really getting to know each other, really understanding how each other work, so that when it comes time to help, it is so much easier. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but it's so much easier to offer advice to somebody if you already know something about them. If you don't, it's pretty generic advice you're offering. It might be good advice, but it's pretty generic. But when you actually get to know somebody and you're familiar with them, then the advice you can give is so much more accurate. I don't know if that's the right word. So much more pertinent. Like there's certain people, you start to know their design style. So when they ask for advice, you give advice that you know that they're going to be comfortable with based on the style of design that they create. Because you don't want to give somebody advice that goes way against their normal style. Anyway, so that's all stuff that people in the Resourceful Designer community are getting to know each other. And it makes the help and the advice and the tips and everything so much better. And we just had our Secret Santa meeting, or video chat, I should say, this past week. And what a great group of people in there. I know I speak for almost all of them, if not all of them, when I say that everybody in the community loves it so much. So that was a big boon to me this past year. Now, I did shut down enrollment back in October, as I really wanted the people in the community to get to know each other, but I'm going to be opening it up again really soon, as soon as the new year gets here, because there's already a lot of people that have signed up to be members of the community and are on the waiting list. And I'm going to have a special bonus for those people who have signed up for the waiting list. So if you are interested in the community, you can visit resourcefuldesigner.com/community and sign up to be notified when it opens. because that little bonus will only apply to those who have signed up. So that's kind of my year in review as far as Resourceful Designer goes. Now, for those of you who may or may not know, I do have a graphic design business. Obviously, I'm a graphic designer. I do a podcast about graphic design or running a business. So I have a business that I run. And my business is Marksman Design. That's the name of it. And wow, 2020. What a... yeah. Well, in 2020, Marksman Design did work for 9 different clients. Now, that's down in 2019. I had done work for 29 different clients. And that's not just projects. I've done multiple projects for clients, and they only count as one client. So the year previous to this, 29, in 2018, I did work for 27 clients. But this past year, I only did work for 9 different clients. And out of those 9, 2 of them were actually first-time clients, which is down from 7 the previous year. So I only had 2 new clients. This is just for Marksman Design. As you may or may not know, I have another business that I'll get to in a minute. But Marksman Design, which is my oldest, the design business that I've been running since 2005, I only had 9 different clients, and 2 of them were new clients, which means I only had 7 returning clients this year. And that just goes to what was happening. A lot of my clients were impacted by COVID. And I lost some clients. Actually, I'll get to that in a minute here. Well, actually, why don't I just get to it right now? I lost, out of my client list, I lost 7 clients this past year so far. I mean, we still have a couple of weeks, so who knows? I lost 2 clients due to, let's call it retirement. One of them is a printer, actually a local printer, not the printer I used to work at, but actually one I did a lot of work with. They were a really good client, long-standing client, and I sent most of the print work that I had for local clients, I had them do it. Well, they decided to shut down the, what they call the commercial side of the business, like the public-facing side of the business. They're still printing, but they're only printing for, I think they have 2 or 3 really big clients that they print stuff on a daily basis. They're only doing those clients now. They're not taking like off the street or designers like myself. They sent a notice saying that they're no longer doing that. And in the process, they were one of my clients. I hosted a website for them. They decided to do away with their website because they don't need it anymore. So I lost them as a client. And I had another client who is an insurance agent, and he's getting close to retirement. And he told me, Mark, he says, I'd like to eliminate or delete my website. He says he no longer wants to grow his business. He's at the point where he's happy with everything the way it's working. He's just, I don't know how the insurance industry works, but he's just going to keep living off the residuals from his commissions for whatever he sells. And he's not taking on any more clients. So therefore, he doesn't need his website anymore. So I lost those 2 clients due to quote unquote retirement. I lost another one that was acquired by another business, and that other business already had a designer. I don't know if it was on staff. I didn't really look into it too much, but I was told my services were no longer required now that they acquired this other business. I did lose 2 clients to COVID that ended up shutting their doors. The lockdowns and everything were just too much for them, and they ended up closing shop. And those people said whatever next venture they're going to do, they'll contact me because they really liked working with me. But they did notify me that the shop that I had done the work for no longer exists. And I did lose 2 clients that switched designers. One of them, I think I talked about it on the podcast earlier this year. There was some sort of mix-up, misunderstanding where they weren't actually a direct client of mine. I was actually hired by a marketing agency to do their work. And then the marketing agency went MIA. They kind of just disappeared. I know it was a 1-person marketing agency, and she had some medical issues. But anyways, I'm not going to get into that. But that client, whenever the marketing agency disappeared, ended up going to hire somebody else to take over their work and not me. So when I reached out to them and to say that, I can work with you directly, it was kind of like, oh, well, too late. We already found somebody else. So I lost them. And there was another one that just for some reason he decided, I think it was, he found out an old friend of his does this similar work. So he decided to switch over to his friend instead of me. So I lost those 2. So anyways, Marksman Design, I lost 7 clients this past year. So it was a really, really tough year for Marksman Design. I saw my income drop drastically. I haven't actually looked at the numbers. I'm going to do that beginning of January at the actual income that I made. But I wouldn't be surprised to find out that this is probably one of my worst years ever since I started my business, if not the worst year. But on the upside, as you may or may not know, I do have another business, podcast branding, that I started in 2018. And podcast branding is what saved me this year. In 2019, so the last year, I had 18 different clients that I did work for podcast branding. This year, that's coming to an end, so far, and I have another meeting on Monday that I don't know if she'll become a client or not, but so far, I've had 51 different clients that I've worked with for podcast branding. So that's more than doubled from the previous year. Now, between podcast branding was a lot of podcast artwork and social media stuff and that. But between podcast branding and Marksman Design, I launched a total of 16 new websites this year. So that was good. I like that. And of course, most of those websites are on a maintenance agreement, which is recurring income. They pay me every month in order to maintain and keep track and make sure the website's secure and all that stuff. So 16 new websites this year. So I am very, very grateful that I decided to start podcast branding because, as I said, Marksman Design took a huge hit, but I was saved from the work I had from podcast branding. So every week on the podcast, when I give you that little section of what I've been up to and all the work, all this past year, almost all the work I talked about was in part of the podcast branding side of the business. And in case you're curious, podcast branding is a doing business as. So everything, as far as the bookkeeping goes, everything's under Marksman Design. Podcast branding is just a division of Marksman Design. But I have I keep track of the things separately, even though at the end of the year, all the numbers get crunched together for one income tax for the one business, Marksman Design. Now, as for the goals that I had set last year, I listened to the podcast to see what sort of goals I had set for 2020. Now, of course, when I recorded this, we had no idea what sort of year 2020 would be. So some of the goals were to, grow the podcast listenership. And I mentioned that earlier. That one was a fail because, with COVID, a lot of people just stopped listening to podcasts. So the numbers did drop. So I am lower than I were the year before, but there's a pretty good excuse for it. Funny enough, even though through the lockdown, one of my goals was to speak more at engagements and stuff like that, to actually be a speaker on stage. And I actually succeeded at that one. I got to talk in March at PodFest in Orlando, Florida. And this was 2 weeks before the lockdown, or roughly about 2 weeks before the lockdown. It was the last in-person conference, or one of the last in-person conferences that were held, at least in the podcast industry. So I did get to speak at that one, and there was a virtual event put on by the same people later in the year, and they invited me to speak at that one as well. So my goal of speaking at events actually came true, because in the last year, in 2019, I didn't speak at a single one. I had been offered, and I wasn't able to attend the thing that they asked me to speak at. I wasn't able to attend, so I never did speak at any. So that one is kind of strange. Even though 2020, we were locked down for the better part of the year, I actually did get to speak at some engagements there. And I'm already lined up to speak at some for 2021, so things are looking good on that front. Now, another one that I actually succeeded at was my goal to grow podcast branding. And as I just mentioned with the numbers, I more than doubled the number of clients I worked with and doing really well with that one. But even though I did succeed in all that, I'm still marking that. I marked it down as a success that I did achieve that goal. But in my mind, it's still a bit of a failure because there's certain things that I wanted to do and I never got around to it. One of the things that I wanted to do, I hadn't really talked about it last year, but one of the things I wanted to do with podcast branding was get more advertising involved. Facebook ads, Instagram ads, Google ads, and all that stuff. And I had every intention, and for one reason or the other, I never did it. The entire year has gone by, and I have not put a single ad out for podcast branding at all. So on that part, that is a huge fail. And I've got nobody to blame but myself. I would just find stupid excuses to put it off and not do it. Now, it was very easy to put it off considering I was still busy. I was still getting work. So in my mind, it's like, yeah, I could advertise, but I'm still getting work right now. So why bother? But no, I really want to do that. So 2021, that's going to be one of my areas that I'm going to concentrate on is advertising to really grow the podcast branding business. Now, kind of funny that one of the goals I set for last year is that I was hoping that at some point, the income I generated through podcast branding would surpass the income I made through Marksman Design. And well, 2020 accomplished that one. So I guess it's a success, but it's a success because my local businesses here, Marksman Design just died down. As I said, I went from 29 different clients in 2019 to only 9 different clients in 2020. So I was hoping that Marksman Design would stay on par and that podcast branding would grow to surpass it. That was my idea when I set the goal, but it just so happened that I ended up achieving the goal because Marksman Design basically tanked. But I know it's going to pick up again coming in this new year. I've already got some inquiries and some people saying that there's some new projects coming early in the year, so it's already looking up for Marksman Design. So that brings me to my goals for 2021. I'm looking at my notes here. I actually wrote goals for 2020. So just can't seem to escape this year. But really, should be goals for 2021. And, most of them are going to end up being pretty well the same goals. I do want to keep growing the podcast listenership. And I already see that on an uptick. So there shouldn't be a big issue with that. Although I might try to do some different things to just grow it. And you can really help me with that. If you know designers that are either maybe at COVID, they started working from home, like they were forced to, and maybe they liked it and they're thinking of maybe doing something on their own, share the podcast. There's lots of great resources, lots of episodes that they would enjoy and that could benefit them. So if you know somebody in that situation, let them know about Resourceful Designer. Of course, as I said, I'm going to be opening up the Resourceful Designer community in early 2021. And that's another goal, is to grow that community and do more with it as well. We're already doing so much and getting to know each other so well, but I really want to make it even better than it is now. So that's a goal for the year. And as I mentioned earlier, I want to grow podcast branding through advertising. I would love to get podcast branding to the point where there's too much work for me to handle on my own and I have to hire others to help me with the work. Now, I already hire people to help me with certain things like illustration, and there's certain things that I can't do or I'm not very good or competent at, so I hire people to do that. But I would love it to get to the point where I need to hire maybe other designers or web people in order to take on certain things so that I can concentrate more on growing the business as an entity. So that's one goal that I'm going to put forward for 2021. And of course, just keep putting out podcast episodes. I still have a huge list of topics I want to get to. But one of the things I do want to do more of is interviews. I know I've only done a handful of interviews across the entire life of this podcast. I think 242 episodes, and I think I've had less than 10 interviews that I've done. I think it's actually 7 or 8 that I've done. But I'd like to change that this year. There are a few people that I really like their story, and it's not just an interview like, hey, how'd you do? I want to find a specific topic that I think would be great for you, and then find somebody that could come on and talk about that specific topic. So I don't want to turn a Resourceful Designer into an interview show. Actually, most of the time it's not going to be. I don't know how many interviews I'll actually do, but it's not going to be an interview show where we just get to know somebody. They're going to be on with a purpose to talk about a specific subject that I think will benefit the people who listen to Resourceful Designer. So that's one of the goals I have for the new year. So those are just some of the goals. There's probably more. I'm going to be thinking up some more goals. I usually sit down more at the beginning of the year. At the end of the year, I tend to look back, and then once the holidays are over, that's when I start looking forward. And at that time, I'm really going to set down the goals and not just set goals, but actually itemize them and divide them up and set time frames for stuff to get done, because that's the way to accomplish a goal. It's one thing to just say you want to accomplish something, It's a completely different matter to actually set a plan in motion that will help you achieve it. So that's what I'm going to be doing probably the first week or two of January, is actually sitting down, looking at everything and saying, okay, now what am I doing this year? And I always love that time of year. I love setting out those goals. I love it more when I accomplish them, but if they're not set, there's nothing to accomplish. But what about you? I'm curious, did you accomplish your goals, the ones you set out for 2020? I don't know, maybe you're a student and this was your final year of school. And if you were, man, I hope you got something out of it. I know so many people with this whole distance learning thing. It was really, really tough. So if you were a graphic design or a web design student this past year, my hat's off to you if you managed to make it through and still learn something pertinent. But if you've just recently graduated or are about to graduate, maybe you're going into your last semester, then what are your goals for the remainder of the year? What are you going to do once you do graduate? Or if you're somebody that maybe you're just new in the industry, design, maybe you graduated a few years ago, or maybe you never went to school. I mean, you don't have to go to school to be a graphic designer or web designer, but maybe you're fairly new to the industry. What are your goals? What are your plans to hone your skills as a designer and to grow? And maybe you're a veteran designer like I am, somebody with probably more years under your belt than are ahead of you. Well, that doesn't mean that we have to stop. Part of being a designer, part of being a creative person is never, ever stop learning. So what are your goals? How are you going to keep growing, even though you've been doing this for decades? What sort of goals are you setting for yourself going forward? Maybe you're a designer working for some other company, maybe an agency, maybe you're an in-house designer for some company or factory or firm or whatever. And who knows, maybe you really enjoy that job, or maybe you don't. Either way, what are your future goals? Do you see yourself there long term, or is this just a stepping stone to something else? Wherever you are living in the world, whatever level of skills you have as a designer, whatever knowledge you have, whatever situation you are in, I want you to take a few moments, look back at 2020. Think about everything that you've accomplished or didn't accomplish. Think about your shortcomings. Think about your failures. You know that we learn from failures. The best way to learn something is by failing. Well, when you did encounter failures or adversity, did you push through? What about your accomplishments, the things you did succeed at? Did you just stop there? Or did you just keep going, plow through, knowing that, yes, I succeeded at that, but there is more that I can reach for? Creative people have to strive. It's in our nature. What's the point of being creative if you can't grow? And you grow by learning from your shortcomings. You learn from your accomplishments. You pick yourself up after your failures. You brush off the discouragements. You ignore the harsh critiques. And you move on. It's just what we do. So tell me, did you actually reach your goals for 2020? And what sort of goals are you going to set for 2021? As this, let's call it farce of a year, 2020 comes to an end, I really want you to take time to reflect on it. On everything you've learned, everything you struggled with, everything you fell short on. Be it whether it was your fault or just the fault of the stage that the world was in this year that none of us had any control over. Think about everything that stood in your way. And then think about how you got to where you are now. There had to be some successes, some accomplishments. If you think of all of those, like really think about them, put them all together, examine them, I'm sure you can come up with a working plan, a goal, if you will, that will make 2021 your year of success. That's what I'm planning on doing. I want to come back at the end of next year with my look back, look ahead, and I want to spew all sorts of the great things that happened to me in 2021. There. That's one goal for next year. Now I'm hoping, keeping my fingers crossed, knocking on wood, whatever it takes, that we never, ever have to encounter another year like 2020. But you know that old saying, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger? Well, everything that we learned this past year about ourselves, about our industry, about our clients, about our skills, about everything will just make us stronger. It'll make us better for the future. So that's my look back and look ahead. Now, there will be no episode for the next couple of weeks. I'm taking a couple of weeks off just by the way Christmas and New Year's and that falls. So I'll be back in January with some new episodes. But in the meantime, if you do want a dose of Resourceful Designer, might I suggest you go back and listen to episode 55, which was setting goals for your design business. It's the perfect episode to listen to at this time of year. But in the meantime, I hope you have a great holiday season, whether you celebrate it or not. If you do celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah to those of you. And to all the other holidays that I don't even know which ones to mention. Let's just put 2020 behind us and concentrate on how we're going to make 2021 an amazing year for us. Until then, I am Mark Decote, wishing you the best holiday season possible. And of course, no episode of Resourceful Designer would be complete if I didn't remind you to stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.